spring 1994 with 2 colleagues, including Bridget. We launched a conference. It's our very first event. It was called Rations to Riesling, Remembering Ontario's Food Heritage. This is at Dune Heritage Crossroads, which of course is now the Waterloo Regional Museum. I just need some water. One of our best occasions was to recognize Liz Driver's Culinary Landmarks bibliography. We had a big conference for that. And also for 6 years, we've co-sponsored Mad for Marmalade, Crazy for Citrus at Fort York. So we've done many interesting programs of all kinds. We started a newsletter immediately, and that was a very simple newsletter at the beginning, but it absolutely grew in sophistication as we became more aware. And so I spent 6 years as the editor of Culinary Chronicles, and I was very proud of that particular accomplishment. So next year will be 20 years. The board has just recently initiated a strategic planning process, because the past couple of years we have lost a bit of momentum, we've lost some energy, some members, but that core group is really keen still, and so we've actually hired a professional facilitator to help us to go forward as a small, non-profit volunteer organization. So despite all this activity, I realized I had to go back to university to get an extra level of credibility. The idea had been percolating in my brain for quite some time, and then literally woke up one day in January 2000, and I said, this is it. And so that day, I started investigating the process of admission to get an MA in Canadian history. So I already had a certificate in theatre design. I had an undergraduate degree in history of fine art, and I had a certificate in museum studies from the Ontario Museum Association. But I really wanted to go back to concentrate on the history of women in the household and the kitchen, especially in Ontario. So I became a part-time grad student, 1 course per term for 6 years, and I loved it. For every lost hour of sleep, I really did enjoy that as I was writing my essays. And it opened whole new areas of historiography to me as well. But when I started, I didn't know what the topic of my major paper would be. I already sensed it would be all the knowledge that I was learning would coalesce into this paper. And eventually I realized, oh, I know what it's going to be. So I happened to read Charlotte Gray's wonderfully evocative Sisters in the Wilderness, The Lives of Susanna Moody and Catharine Parr Traill in March 2001. So it was a year and a half into my grad work at this point. And the sisters were described by Charlotte Gray in ways I was very moved by, but she said something. Susanna didn't brag about the fact that before they all left the woods, Catharine acknowledged her as the best baker of breads and pies in the district. And I was really intrigued by this because I didn't know how Charlotte Gray knew that. So I started to discuss this with Liz Driver, and she said that during her preparation of Culinary Landmarks, she came to realize Traill's Female Immigrant's Guide was the first authentic culinary voice in Canada. And Liz also mentioned that the National Archives holds a draft of an unpublished, revised guide. So at this point, my sleuthing instincts got on high alert, and thus was born my decision to read and write about the position of the Canadian Settler's Guide in the context of Canadian culinary literature and historiography. But of course, one of the important things that I learned immediately is that Catharine's title was the Female Immigrant's Guide and hints on Canadian housekeeping. So clearly her title had summarized her subject and her audience, but it was her publisher who changed and truncated it after the first printing, thinking he'd get more sales, but it actually demoted Catharine's own emphasis on women's work. So I should actually say that I decided to reread the Canadian Settler's Guide. I first read the paperback reprint, the McClellan Stewart one, back in 1981 when I was 25, and I had a summer job as historical interpreter at Westfield Heritage Village, which is just near Rockton here. And there I am in my very first costume in 1981. And then I went back last June. So this is the Lockwood House where I first learned. So I'd read sections of the guide as part of my training for animating the Lockwood family log cabin, but it was the candle making that first caught my interest. So of course, little did I realize that 2 decades later, this book would be really essential to me. Although during the ensuing years, I did actually sporadically use all of Traill's books as sources of historical information for Foodways and women's lives. But it wasn't until I began my thesis that I came to fully appreciate the degree to which she was a very, very vivid archivist of a vanished way of life from a woman's point of view. So such is my attachment to her that I kind of feel Catharine, Traill and I are friends, personal friends, and I feel like I'm being quite inseparable from her because I've just sort of absorbed her and absorbed her books. So let me summarize the importance of the Female Emigrant's Guide and her achievement. So first of all, as a foundational author of Canadian literature, Catharine Parr Traill's writings have been much studied, much examined, except the mostly forgotten guide. So from a very rare female perspective, it documents a remarkably detailed and authentic view of domesticity, material culture, and the foodways of mid-19th century rural households. And it is quite distinct from any previous publication because it blends 4 genres: Female Emigrant's Manual, Backwoods Housewifery Handbook, Regional Cookbook, and a Kitchen Garden Text. It's all in this one unique practical whole. So recognizing the huge gap in the available immigration information, Traill very explicitly situates her unusual book into the nascent literature of colonial Canada, but more specifically into the tiny subcategory of English language colonial literature about household management and cookery. So as the first cookbook expressly written for the Canadian context by a Canadian author, Traill showed newcomer women from Britain, just like she had been once 2 decades earlier, how to make those tasty meals with indigenous wildlife and foodstuffs, and how to adapt familiar English recipes with unfamiliar Canadian crops like buckwheat, Indian corn, squirrels. And she superbly articulated the foodways of her time and her place. And it's an attribute that's been pretty well snubbed by literary scholars, but is now being very much acclaimed by food historians. And in addition, Catharine managed to find this balance between the gendered ideal of female dependencies and the settlement reality of the hard labor of setting up a home in the backwoods. So for 6 decades, Traill voiced this daily life of pioneer housewives in the very alien geographical and social circumstances of pre-Confederation Ontario. So in 1826, just to backtrack a little bit, even before arriving in Canada, she did write about settlement. So the first children's novel partially set in Canada is called The Young Emigrants, or Pictures of Canada Calculated to Amuse and Instruct the Minds of Youth. So she wrote this about an English family starting a farm here, but it was entirely based on secondhand knowledge that she gained from immigration material she read, and also her brother's letters, Sam Strickland's brother's letters home. And she wrote it with no idea that, of course, one day she too would be emigrating to the backwoods herself. And when she eventually settled in the backwoods in Upper Canada in the 1830s, of course, as most of you know, she wrote her own letters home, and they were soon published as the Backwoods of Canada, and they revealed some very personal experience about cooking, maple sugaring, preserving, general housewifery. But she's still doing this with the major assistance of servants. But gradually, her husband, her intellectual husband, Thomas Traill, sank into debt, sank into despair. He was simply totally ill-equipped to be a pioneer farmer. So, of course, Catharine continued to write to earn money for her very poor family. And all through the 1840s and 50s, she was writing these numerous sketches and columns about pioneer life. They're full of domestic details. And she also wrote a wilderness survival manual. It was framed as an adventure novel for children called Canadian Crusoes, or A Tale of the Rice Lake Plains. And her heroine, Catharine Maxwell, very much embodies the prototype of a new character. The robust, the dutiful, the talented, the independent pioneer woman. And that ideal reverberates through Canadian fiction from then on. So in 1854, then she came to the Female Emigrant's Guide, and then of course it was the culmination of all of her housewifery experience and advice. But it was also partially a response to her siblings' books, Susanna Moody's Roughing It in the Bush, and Sam Strickland's 27 Years in Canada West, so 1852, 1853, and her book's 1854. It was reprinted many times throughout the 1860s. It was handed to many emigrant and immigrant families. And then eventually in the 1880s, she decided that she would revise it, but then she abandoned that manuscript. It was quite outdated. And that was the one that Liz Driver had told me about. And it's quite fascinating because it's a copy of her guide, and she's got handwritten revisions all the way through it. So from my perspective as a culinary historian, Catharine Parr Traill's Female Emigrant's Guide is quite unique within Canadian literature. It's been very much misunderstood and underrated and neglected for her books of botany and literature. But you know, as a household manual, I maintain that that's precisely why it deserves the attention that it should get, the reconsideration. So of course, none of this would have been apparent to me unless I'd had all these previous years of reading, cooking, teaching, learning. So my career developed in such a way that it led me to investigating this particular book. So at a very, very personal, kind of superstitious level, I feel like I was led to this particular book. It kind of feels like inevitable. It's not, of course, but you know, that in that very personal way, I feel that it has been. I think Catharine Parr Traill is a truly remarkable individual, and I think she deserves huge, huge recognition and admiration. So, so I moved out of the City of Toronto Museums, like I said, but I still keep my hand in. So I just mentioned the strategic planning that culinary historians are about to undergo. I recently went to Deerfield Village in Massachusetts for an intensive 3-day seminar on recipe research with Sandy Oliver. If you don't know who Sandy Oliver is, she's absolutely one of the leading food historians in North America. She is truly astonishing. So I was able to have 3 very intensive days with her. My current biggest project, of course, is republishing the guide, but with Natalie, a cook. Natalie's here. She surprised me yesterday by showing up. So Natalie and I are doing this together. We don't know when it's going to be, but hopefully, as I see in here, 1914 with a question mark. But I do have other Traill projects in my back pocket. Next year, for instance, I'm going to go to the cookbook conference in New York in February. Next year, I believe, will be the 5th one. And I actually want to take information about the Female Emigrant's Guide to New York, to the Americans, and kind of explain to them how important this book is. Because as far as I can tell, there's no American publication like it. And as far as I can tell, there's no other publication like it either in any of the other colonies in New Zealand, Australia, anywhere. So can't prove that yet, but I don't think so. So, you know, it really is astonishing. And the other thing I want to explore for Traill is her culinary journalism, actually as a journalist. So I have a number of things like that I still want to do. So I'm very fortunate that I'm in a position that I turned 60 in 4 years' time, and I actually have the opportunity probably to take early retirement. And if I do, I fully plan to resume full-time food history work, maybe even go back and do a PhD. I'd love to do that. But you know, whatever happens, Catharine Parr Traill will be very much part of what I do. So her culinary writing. So along with all the other women, you know, in their kitchens. This will be a major part of what I do for the rest of my life. So that's where I am right now in my career as a honest-to-goodness culinary historian.
morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today and to talk a little bit more about the Foodways program at Fort York National Historic Site. You've already been introduced a little bit to it with Fiona's talk, and I had the fortune of joining the team at Fort York in the kitchen along with Fiona as the lead cook or the senior interpreter there a couple of years later. And I've also been fortunate enough to inherit this program that she worked so hard to develop and continue. And the program probably would not exist today if it wasn't for Fiona creating a volunteer aspect to it. Previously, it's been all just staff, and now we have this very dedicated group of volunteers that make the program so viable today. We have approximately 20 volunteers